Welcome, everybody. My name is Arik Burakovsky, and I am the Associate Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. We're glad to have you join us for our panel discussion today titled Endgame in the War, the Future of U.S. Policy Toward NATO, Ukraine, and Russia. Please note that the event is being recorded. I know that some students are already on spring break, traveling, so we're going to share the recording with them afterward. We do have some attendees on Zoom. This conversation will focus on the evolving approach of the second Trump administration to European security, Russia, and Ukraine. In the past month, we've witnessed a significant shift in U.S. policy toward the Russia-Ukraine war. We're pleased to collaborate on this event with the Tufts International Relations Program and the Department of Political Science. The last 2 weeks in particular have been a whirlwind. Following the recent onset of direct U.S.-Russia negotiations and the Oval Office spat with Zelensky, Trump froze military and intelligence aid last week, only to unfreeze it 2 days ago after Ukraine's agreement to offer a 30-day ceasefire and Zelensky's willingness to sign the critical minerals deal. At the same time, the hostilities rage on, and Russia has nearly taken the Kursk region in the past day, just as we speak, raising urgent questions about Ukraine's negotiating position, the feasibility of a negotiated settlement, and the future of U.S. and European support to Ukraine. This moment represents a critical juncture, which we will talk about today. Is the United States moving toward a long-term policy of conditioning aid to Ukraine on economic concessions and diplomatic progress? What role will NATO and European countries play if the United States ultimately backs away from supporting Ukraine? How is Ukraine reacting to Trump's transactional approach to alliances and military commitments? And how is Russia interpreting these developments? Does it see them as an opportunity or as a constraint? To explore these pressing questions, we're fortunate to have an outstanding panel of 5 professors, all of them affiliated with Fletcher or Tufts in one way or another, who bring deep expertise on U.S. foreign policy, transatlantic security, Ukrainian foreign policy, and Russia's strategic calculations. I am honored to moderate this conversation and introduce each of our distinguished panelists. Each speaker will have up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So our first speaker is Daniel Drezner, who is a distinguished professor of international politics, a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and co-director of the Russia and Eurasia Program here at Fletcher. His expertise includes economic statecraft, U.S. grand strategy, global political economy, and power in world politics. Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Arik. So just quickly, it's worth noting that the reason this war has gone on for 3 years is that both sides have had, up until recently, a plausible theory of victory. You can argue that the Russian side basically believed that quantity was quality, and that while obviously the initial invasion in February of 2022 didn't work out as they had planned, they simply thought that they could wait Ukraine out, that they had simply more material resources, and grind down the armed forces of Ukraine to the point where they would be able to achieve the sort of facts on the ground that they wanted. Ukraine had a theory of victory as well for a while, which was the fact that the morale of the Ukrainian armed forces, along with greater technological sophistication, thanks to military aid from European members of NATO as well as the United States, would give them an advantage on the battlefield. And because Russia was sort of straining in terms of its economic capacity to be able to fight the war, there were a lot of, speculation in the fall of Russia has maybe 6 months to be able to fight until really inflation spirals out of control, or they're going to have to take some other action. The problem that has happened is that essentially Trump's victory negates the Ukrainian theory of victory and substantiates the Russian theory of victory. Russia's plan, you could argue, was their sort of hinge point was what was going to happen in the November 2024 election, because Trump's theory of the case is that he, I believe, is legitimately, or not legitimately, he genuinely wants to try to fashion some sort of great power peace. He wants some sort of concert between the United States, Russia, and China that allows each actor to have its sphere of influence. And therefore, in Trump's mind, Ukraine is in the Russian sphere of influence. I think the other thing that has been guiding Trump is his knowledge, and this is where he's correct, is that the United States has considerable leverage over Ukraine, as we've seen for the last 2 weeks, which is unsurprising in terms of theories of economic coercion. Economic coercion and also other forms of coercion much more likely to work when you're dealing with allies as opposed to adversaries, because you don't necessarily anticipate frequent conflicts down the road. We've seen this play out over the last 2 weeks in terms of Ukraine agreeing to the 30-day ceasefire and potentially, signing the minerals deal. The problem with all of this, though, is that from the Russian perspective, it's not obvious to me that they have any incentive whatsoever to accept a ceasefire beyond the belief that they might gain something strategically from a genuine entente with the United States. From the Russian perspective, their theory of victory is pretty solid at this point. They know that the United States has proven to be an unreliable ally. They don't take Europe seriously. They're winning on the battlefield. They have said in the last 48 hours they are concerned that the problem with the ceasefire is that it allows Ukraine to rearm itself. And the announcement, I think, in the last hour or two that Putin said, well, I might in principle be okay with a 30-day ceasefire, but I've got a lot of questions. It would not shock me if those questions make the ceasefire extremely difficult to actually execute. This is an area where I think the one thing that Trump has not quite yet figured out is that leverage over Ukraine does not necessarily translate to leverage over Russia. And I think the really key question in negotiations going forward is, will there be a moment where the Trump administration, seeing that Russia is proving to be recalcitrant in terms of agreeing to a ceasefire, decides they have to then amp up the pressure on Russia, either by sending a massive number of weapons to Ukraine or through, bellicose threats or so on and so forth. Trump has occasionally tweeted this stuff out, occasionally threatening tariffs on Russia, which does lead me to wonder whether he knows that we already have sanctions on Russia. But that's an entirely separate situation. I do think it's worth noting, and I'll close on this point, that, there is significant amounts of evidence there, evidence that Russia's not really all that interested in making any concessions. To put it gently, when you've lost Tom Graham as someone who's analyzing Russia, Tom Graham has made it very clear he doesn't think that Russia is interested in a ceasefire. We've seen reports of think tank analyses provided to the Russian government from the FSB, where they basically reject almost anything that would actually make a ceasefire viable. And the truth is that over the last 36 months, Russia's demonstrated little to zero flexibility in terms of negotiation. So I think the big macro political question is whether Trump can spin any kind of surrender from Ukraine as an actual negotiated ceasefire. And I'll close on that point.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker is Monica Toft, who is the academic dean and professor of international politics and director of the Center for Strategic Studies here at Fletcher. Her research focuses on U.S. foreign and national security policy, interstate and civil wars, territory and nationalism, demography, and religion and global politics. Monica, please.
Thanks, Arik. And I'm actually going to talk about all of that in my comments. So Dan talked about Russia, right? And Russia's willingness, capability to actually have a ceasefire and accept perhaps a negotiated settlement. I'm going to revert and talk a little bit about Ukraine. And, my first book, my dissertation at the University of Chicago, where Dan and I hung out, and actually that's where I first met Oxana, was at the University of Chicago. I wrote on the geography of ethnic violence. And I spent the summer of 1994 in Ukraine. Actually, it was summer of 1992, and it was a brand new country. And there was this Tatar, I described this in my book, in front of this Cossack, in front of the parliament building, handing out bags of dirt. Right? But these aren't just any bags of dirt. This is soil from Crimea, and affixed to it is a golden seal, a wax seal with the Ukrainian trident, right? Soil is everything. And Crimea, the Ukrainians see that as part of their soil, and you damn well sure that they see the other 4 provinces that Russia under Putin has now put into the constitution as part of Russian Federation. So nationalism, we're not talking about this at all, right? The idea of nationalism and what it means for states when their territories have been invaded. So for a nation, territory is at the heart of it, right? They want sovereign control so they can control their language, control their region, control their religion, right? And control who's born there and who can come in and out of that territory. So territory is really important because it's tied to political sovereignty. And then there's all kinds of historical narratives as to how people got that sovereignty. And it usually involves a lot of bloodletting, unfortunately. So territory is a foundational element. It's a material element. It's very important, the physicality, what resources are in there, but it's also emotional. So it's very hard for any political leader, a wartime leader, to think about losing bits and pieces of territory because of that emotional tie and the historical significance and the need in the state system to maintain your territorial integrity. And losing land is seen as an existential threat, right? The Ukrainians are very clear, and it's true, they have nowhere else to go. Where else are they going to go, right? This is their homeland. This is where they have the capacity to speak their language and figure out who is going to live there. And so defending that territory becomes a moral imperative, as we've seen. It's one of the reasons why they fought as clearly and formidably as they have. So why do people fight and die for their nation? It's just not about states. The reason, and it's really striking about nations and about co-nationals, when you think about religious actors, particularly in the Abrahamic traditions, when they're fighting and dying, often they're doing God's work, but they're going to get a benefit. They personally are going to get a benefit. And what is that benefit? They're going to go to heaven. They're going to get some virgins at their doorstep, right? But for a co-national, you're often fighting and dying for the benefit of the nation. Think about that sacrifice, right? You're not, as an individual, going to benefit individually for that. Your nation's going to benefit. And that collective memory. So it's about perpetuating the nation in honor of those who preceded you, your ancestors, and making sure that nation can perpetuate into the future. So people fight and die really hard. And I've worked on research that shows that nationalists fight even harder than those who have religion as their core belief for what they're fighting for, which means nations do not surrender easily. Zelensky, yes, he's a very good wartime leader, but he also supports a population, and the population, 51%, only 51%, it's split. Support, this is as of yesterday, support negotiations. They want to keep fighting. 49% of the nation wants to keep fighting. So even when they're temporarily defeated, and let's say we have a way to victory that Professor Drezner points out, there's still long memories here. That's the other thing about nations. They have really, really long memories. They go back centuries to when the nation founded. And the vengeance narrative comes in, where you want to avenge the deaths of earliers. And sacrifices made during the conflict become embedded in that national identity and part and parcel of that narrative that kind of perpetuates itself. So in the implications for the war in Ukraine, Ukraine, even if it relinquishes, it's forced to, but remember, Ukraine has a lot of autonomy, and the United States is not the only actor. And by the way, Russia's not the only actor. The big question mark we're all keeping an eye is, can the Europeans get their act together and have cohesion, have unity in order to help the Ukrainians? Because they see it as an existential threat. They do not want war again in Europe, and they see war in Europe. The Americans, we have a big moat between us. So the problem is, at this point, Putin's very smart strategically, is that the Russians do see, and they have seen, parts of this territory as part of their national identity. So we have really strong national dynamics or nationalism dynamics on both sides. And then on top of that, when we're thinking about a post-war settlement, so that's the nation nationalism territoriality piece, is that Ukraine is wrecked. Right. So let's just go through the numbers. This is as of yesterday. So for Russia, 800,000 men and women have emigrated. That's 0.6% of the population. For Ukraine, it's 23% of its population has been displaced. 3.7 million internally and 6.5 million are now international refugees. The issue with this, in terms of why it matters for settlement, is that those who stayed, right, and fought the fight, are going to there's going to be resentment in this society. and create fractures across the society. So reintegration is going to be challenging with accusations of cowardice and or betrayal. We don't want to forget that. And it's likely going to surface once we start trying to, or they start trying to build the economy. The economic devastation, Ukraine's economy has shrunk 22.6% since 2002. Growth is projected to recover in 2025, but it's 2.5%. Think about the amount of growth they're going to need in order to restructure that society and build again. The budget deficit in 2024 stood at 20.4% of GDP. And the hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency, has lost 26% of its value. And perhaps even more critically, infrastructure. 64% of Ukrainians' electricity generation capacity has been destroyed or is currently occupied by Russian troops. And the country is relying, tragically, on aging Soviet-era nuclear power plants. We know how well those do, particularly in Ukraine. And then there's divisions between the fighters and those who fled. Many Ukrainian men have been conscripted or volunteered, while others left the country, often with their families. And so the reintegration of refugees, which they're going to need this human capital come back in. It's not going to be seamless. And as I said, there's going to be a lot of resentments, and a lot of the brunt is going to be borne by women, because you've lost the lifeblood of the young men. And so women are going to have to do a lot of work. And why this matters in reconstruction is that Ukraine is a patriarchal society. It's a Slavic society. Historically, post-war societies that integrate women effectively into reconstruction do better, obviously, but the transition's never smooth. So the question is can Ukrainian society culture transform to allow women to do the role that they're going to have to do? And like I said, there's already diverging opinions on peace. 59% of Russians, by the way, support negotiations, peace negotiations. So they're wary of the war continuing despite the propaganda and the control of media coming out of Moscow. And then Ukraine, 51%. So there's a real split. 49% would like peace. So this is going to, lead to disagreement about the kind of settlement and whether settlement. So I raise these issues to you because as we go into the negotiations and we have the Trump administration trying to negotiate peace, have you heard talk of nationalism, the nation, the meaning of the territory? No. We have had peace, violence, and conflict in the Middle East. The heart of it is about territory. Who owns it? Who has the rightful ownership to it? And so these considerations really need to be at the forefront for thinking through and recognizing that each side does see this as valuable territory, although I would make the case very clearly that Ukraine has a right, is the more proper owner of this territory than Russia is of the occupied territories. So thank you, Arik.
Thank you, Monica. Our next speaker is Volodymyr Dubovyk, who is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for International Studies at Odessa II Mechnikov National University in Ukraine, and a non-resident senior fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. He is a former visiting professor at Tufts University, and he is one of the preeminent Ukrainian experts in the field of international affairs, security studies, and foreign policy analysis. Volodymyr, we're pleased to have you join us virtually.
Thank you, Arik. I hope you can hear me well. And I also I feel I should start by saying that I'm really pleased to be with you virtually. I have many fond memories about my time at Fletcher, at Tufts back in 22, 23, and working with you, Arik, and Dan and Monica, and of course, Oxana, whom I actually know for many years now. We are in an interesting position now. In the recent few days or weeks, I've been often asked, what can you say about the recent developments? And I often reply, like, by recent, do you mean like the last hour or two? Or are we talking about like last week or something? So here is no exception today, because of course, Mr. Putin made a great favor for our panel, because he made his last statement about whether he's accepting ceasefire or not in the most vague manner as expected, and basically not saying yes yes or no clearly, just in time for our panel to begin. But this is interesting because I actually thought that he would most probably accept the ceasefire, which ran contrary to the opinion of many of my colleagues who said, no, Russia would definitely reject it. But I thought that this idea of a ceasefire was, first of all, I think, negotiated and talked about between Washington and Moscow even prior to the meeting in Jeddah. Secondly, I think that Putin wants to appear as someone who is willing to have peace, a dove mostly, almost kinda, and therefore he wouldn't want to say, no, we don't want ceasefire. But the same thing as Zelensky, he is smart enough to understand that the core questions need to be discussed. And that's why he is agreeing to the ceasefire is kind of different from what Ukraine does, because Ukraine gave unconditional consent to the ceasefire, while Russia is giving conditional consent. It seems they might still clarify their position and bring more clarity. But he says, yes, in principle, I like the idea of ceasefire, but this and this should be done. This is not surprising because it's never been about ceasefire. We would have been able to sign tens and dozens of ceasefires with Russia, in the last 3 years. The whole point was always for Ukraine is what kind of ceasefire and what comes after ceasefire. I call this the core issues, and they are at the agenda, at the top of agenda for both Moscow and Kyiv. Security guarantees. You actually have the same words used by Kremlin and Kyiv. The Russians talk about security guarantees, we talk about security guarantees as well. I mean, of course, we reject the very notion that Russian security is under threat in any way, or was back in 22, and that's why they decided, and they had to, to do the special military operation invasion of Ukraine. But our security is definitely under a lot of stress. This is an existential fight for us. So therefore, we want to know what's going to happen to security guarantees and what's going to happen to, peacekeepers, if they're coming or not, what kind of peacekeepers, how many, we need to know the details. As Americans like to say, the devil is in details. So that's exactly what Zelensky has been trying to talk about with Washington for the last few weeks, including in that historic meeting in the White House when he tried to switch the conversation towards some of those core issues, and what's going to happen to Ukraine joining or not joining NATO. Okay, so we understand we're not joining anytime soon, but will there be a permanent ban or some kind of a temporary ban on Ukraine's membership? Would we be forced to sign a neutrality treaty, non-alignment treaty, by both Moscow and Washington, what about this demilitarization? Russia continues to insist on demilitarization, including today's remarks by Putin. This is all meaningful questions for Ukraine. If we agree to demilitarization, that's a surrender, that's capitulation of Ukraine. So Ukraine clearly didn't fight for 3 years and lose so much, just to sign up to this capitulation and surrender right now. And by the way, the situation at the front line has been kind of stabilized in many places in the south and east of Ukraine in the last few weeks and months, at a huge cost to Ukrainians, and Ukrainians are still stretched and exhausted, as Russians are. The Kursk developments, if we would have a chance to talk more about it later, but we can do. That, of course, is going to be a defeat for Ukraine, but quite anticipated one. I don't think anyone in this room or elsewhere expected Ukraine to keep Kursk for a lot of time, for years, under its control. So therefore, there was something to be expected. Moreover, I would even venture, going into this kind of conspiracy theory territory, really, that maybe it was discussed in Jeddah or between Washington and Kyiv that, to facilitate discussions on the ceasefire, Ukrainians might need to withdraw from Kursk, an upper hand, which was also connected, of course, with Ukrainians not having enough of intelligence sharing and satellite images and so on coming from the US. So finally, maybe in my opening remarks, I should say that I'm not necessarily optimistic about any of it, about the Trump's administration approach. I was one of the Ukrainian scholars who was quite confident throughout this last several months that return of Trump to the White House is bad news to Ukraine. Unlike many Ukrainians, because many Ukrainians were so aggrieved and angered and annoyed with Biden's spoon feeding of Ukraine over the last 3 years, all these delays, all this hesitations and timidity, and all this fears of escalation by Russia and the lack of understanding whether they want for Ukraine to win or not, whether they want Russia to be defeated or not. Ukrainians were fed up, and then many of them were ready for the gamble. Like, okay, bring the Trump back, and he's disruptive, he's unpredictable, he's unconventional, unorthodox. So maybe it will turn out for better for Ukraine somehow. But I was never of that opinion, and what I'm seeing in the last few weeks, I think validates my point of view. I mean, of course, theoretically, Trump can still do a big turn, a big shift, a big 180, but I don't think he will, because I actually do think that he has several priorities right now. I mean, he wants a fast track to peace, quotation marks, whatever peace. He doesn't care about the quality of the peace at all. Just to sign something where he appears as a major world leader and great diplomat and everything, and give him the Nobel Peace Prize already. All right, so that's one priority. Another priority is based on his affinity for Putin, for Russia, which was always obvious, and at the same time, which was coupled by his hostility towards Ukraine, which was again always obvious for years, really from 2016 and 19 and other important moments, milestones. And finally, I think his priority is really to make a reset, have a reset with Russia, open this new era of strategic partnership and cooperation with Russia. And maybe that idea, strange idea, which I find very naive, based on pure illusion that somehow you can split China and Russia and bring Russia on the side of the United States in the coming conflict, great power conflict against China. Ukrainians want peace, but we always knew that we don't want peace at any cost, at any means, and we need to know what kind of peace is it going to look like. And therefore Ukrainians, if you say some of them want to fight, no, none of us want to fight. Not the people in the trenches right now, not the people like myself who are not in the trenches right now. We all want peace, but we want the peace, not just in quotation marks, but something that will guarantee to us that we'll be better protected, better prepared than we were in February of 2022. And that's what Zelensky is talking about, and that's why he's actually basing on the consensus existing in Ukrainian society. He's really reflecting the mood and the spirit of the society, and that's why, by the way, his ratings are going up quickly now in the recent weeks, and level of trust of public towards Zelensky, because among other things, he's been attacked and humiliated by his American counterparts. So that's how Ukrainians see it. And of course, as someone who dedicated decades really to fostering US-Ukraine cooperation and trust and working together, I must say that this current level of feeling of betrayal and being backstabbed is not a nice feeling, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Volodymyr. And I will echo what you said. We miss you a lot here at Fletcher and Tufts, and we hope you will join us again in Boston.
Thank you. So do I. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Oxana Shevel, who is an associate professor of comparative politics at the Department of Political Science and the director of the International Relations Program at Tufts University. I'm sorry. Thank you, Dan. Before we turn to Oksana, you know what? Since I've started introducing Oksana, we'll go with you, and then we'll finish with Mikhail Troitskiy. She specializes in the post-Soviet region, especially Ukraine and Russia, and issues such as nation building and identity politics, citizenship policies, memory politics, church-state relations, and the democratization process in the post-Soviet region. So we've changed our speaking order just a little bit. Oksana, the floor is yours.
May as well. Thank you, Arik. Some of the points I was going to make have already been made in various ways, so I'll try to keep my comments brief. I basically want to make maybe just 2 points in my opening remarks. The first being that Russia-Ukrainian goals remain irreconcilable. They have been irreconcilable since the beginning of this war back in 2014, and that remains the case today, so I will elaborate a little bit on that. And the second point I want to make is that even though I agree with Dan that Ukraine maybe doesn't have a clear path to victory, certainly not in the way that, many hoped in the earlier years of the war, I also don't think there is a path to Ukrainian voluntary surrender. So in other words, the notion that Ukraine would just cave in if Putin and or Trump lean hard enough on Ukraine and would just give what essentially Putin demands and what Trump may be willing to back in order for a quick deal, that's also not likely to happen. So I would want to elaborate a little bit on these 2 points. Many of my IR colleagues have insisted that this war has been about NATO. This is Putin's position, that really, it's Ukraine potentially joining NATO, that threatens Russian security and all of this. I have argued with my co-author and separately that this is not the case. NATO at best is sort of necessary but not sufficient condition, or outright a red herring, because Ukraine was never going to enter into NATO. Putin very well knew that. That remains the case, that now essentially NATO taken off the agenda. So sort of to think that this is kind of the linchpin of a settlement, I think is really misunderstanding. And even territorial concessions, as much as, Putin has demanded that not only the territory Russia de facto occupies, but these additional territory of the 4 regions that they have declared to be in their constitution, even if Ukraine sort of de facto Russia holds on to this, I would say even that is not enough, because that still leaves sovereign westward-leaning Ukraine with independent government in Kyiv, and this is something that is just not acceptable to Putin. So this whole narrative that it is illegitimate government since pro-Western government came to power in 2014 after Euromaidan, the push for Kyiv in 2022 to decapitate essentially Zelensky government with a hope to install some kind of puppet, and this document, that FSB document that was leaked by the Washington Post yesterday, and that you were referring to, that's exactly what it says. It says regime change in Ukraine cannot be done from within, meaning that even if they explicitly say that, even if there are elections with pro-Russian parties allowed to run, there is no credible scenario where some sort of Russia-friendly leader can take power in Ukraine. These leaders poll to the extent that they exist in like low single-digit numbers. So the notion that there could be sort of democratic process that would bring to power in Kyiv some sort of Lukashenko-like government is just not in the works, and Russia acknowledges this, at least in this FSB does. And therefore, they say that needs to be complete dismantling, that's a direct quote, complete dismantling of Ukrainian state, right? So this is the kind of thing, we sort of get back to Monica's point, that there is a division in Ukrainian society on do we fight or do we sort of want negotiated settlement. That is true, and that is important point. But I think when we say that people want peace, again, to Volodymyr's point, what kind of peace people want, right? People want the end of the war, but they do not want to surrender their sovereignty to Russia. So these specific things that I think have been and would continue to become a bone of contention is the so-called demilitarization of Ukraine that Putin has insisted, which is a complete no-no to Ukraine, because essentially it says Ukrainian army would be reduced, whatever it was, 80,000 people, when, currently it's close to 1 million. Zelensky says that's what we need, that Ukraine would not receive Western weapons, the security guarantees that Volodymyr talked about, again, something that Russia flat out refuses. And again, sort of the broader point of it is that this enables Ukraine to exist even in reduced borders. So the fact that Russia may hold on to some territory, and even if Ukraine, I agree with Monica, I think the kind of the sovereignty and identity and territory are very tightly connected. So Zelensky actually says it's a red line to formally relinquish this territory, which would, by the way, require constitutional change in the referendum in Ukraine. But at the same time, I think some sort of agreement where Ukraine would de facto sort of sign something along the lines that we commit to not try to retake it militarily or something like this in the short term, or something, right? Some kind of diplomatic language. I think it could be hypothetically possible. But again, that would be far short of what Putin wants. So that sort of, and then sort of brings me to, my last point, that what kind of potential scenarios going forward. I totally agree with what Dan says. The big unknown here, what would Trump administration do, right? So in other words, but sort of question mark, because if Russia continues to insist, as it has, with this sort of like, yes, we like the idea of the ceasefire, but we need our core interests addressed and so forth. So would Trump then lean on Putin finally and say like, okay, Putin, this is very simple. You stop shooting for 30 days, yes or no? Are you like in the game? Are you not in the game? If you're not in the game, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to use slam sanctions, so forth. Or would he say, well, Zelensky is easier to bully because, that's a small country and I don't like him, and would come back on Ukraine and say like, agree to X, Y, Z, and essentially begin to cross into right? So that's sort of something that we don't know. Now, assuming, which if I had to put my money on one of these two scenarios, I would put my money on Trump pressuring Zelensky rather than Putin. Now, if this were to happen, then again, sort of the next decision tree becomes, what would Europeans do? I totally agree with that as well. Because Ukrainians, and I also want to reiterate that they will not surrender. There is no government in Kyiv. All these opposition leaders that supposedly the Trump administration met with, all of these sort of various political figures in Ukraine, there is nobody who would deliver voluntarily surrender of Ukraine to Putin, right? So then the question is, if Ukraine decides to fight and Europeans back it enough, we are sort of like, looking at least in the short to medium term continuation of more or less what we have here. Now, if, say, European aid were to be insufficient and Russia proved to be stronger, then at some point, it could be months, it could be another year, give or take, there could be another attack on Kyiv. There could be, I think that couldn't be excluded, there could be destruction, decapitation of Ukrainian government. There still wouldn't be a surrender. And then what do we need? We basically need a puppet regime, puppet government in Ukraine. And the only way this regime can stay in power would be with a full-scale occupation and the presence of Russian troops. It's a big country. It's not like, a million people. It's still a big country, big territory. Then the question becomes, and I'll leave you with this thought, would US-Russian occupational force be backing pro-Russian puppet in Kyiv? And I think that is the kind of scenario that is maybe not likely in the immediate term, but I think is something that we should keep in consideration.
Wow, thanks, Oksana. And finally, Mikhail, apologies again, visiting professor at Fletcher and a visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. In the 2023-2024 academic year, he was a professor of practice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interests include Russian politics and foreign relations, international security, conflict resolution, and negotiation. Mikhail, please.
Yeah, thank you, Arik. So I thought I'd just make one conceptual point and one very practical point, kind of trying to deconstruct Russia's sort of negotiation strategy. So let me just ask you a question. Can you think of a war of the scale of Russo-Ukrainian war that was effectively terminated through mediation? I mean, hundreds of thousands of casualties, 1,000 plus long battle lines, mobilizations of societies and so forth. Have there really been precedents in history? We discussed it with students in my class the day before yesterday. So any thoughts, any quick ideas, anything? We can ask AI actually and see what's up there. Well, I mean, AI says, look at Congo wars, millions of dead, heavy fighting and so forth, but it's clearly very much sort of detached from the realities of, two industrialized states fighting an interstate war, right? Then someone suggested Russo-Japanese War of 1905, which was effectively terminated through mediation by President Roosevelt right outside of Massachusetts, up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But that was already kind of a truce and a peace deal signed after the war more or less burnt out. So now the question is, and Dean Toft just said very high academic standard for our discussion. So we are here somewhere in between conceptually this give war a chance, a kind of argument, right, from Edward Luttwak, and the argument about the resilience of ceasefires made by a number of scholars, Paige Fortner and others. So where are we? And so my point is that's indeed a very, very high bar to ensure, termination of a war of that scale through effective mediation at a stage, as other speakers seem to have indicated, when there's no mutually hurting stalemate, when there's still, determination to fight, at least in some quarters, on both sides. So can you really, achieve a ceasefire? And now the problem with all ceasefires is clearly this commitment, right? Where does commitment to stopping the hostilities come from if there's a ceasefire? And usually, as authors tell us, it comes from strong, vigorous mediation, sort of troops, peacekeeping troops on the ground, kind of sanctions against those who might try and break the peace and so forth. Is that really present? I mean, these are all open questions. The jury is still out because we do have an unprecedented situation. That's my first point, right? Nothing like that has ever happened before, and the history is being written as we speak. Now, if we talk about the Russian position, it's kind of interesting if you follow, the discourse and the developments in Russia. So initially, when Donald Trump was elected, I guess, and right before he was elected as U.S. president, I think there was much concern in Russia in that debate about his unpredictability, about whether he's going to support Russia or whether he's going to be neutral, whether he's going just to slam Russia with new sanctions and demand immediate peace and evacuation of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. And then Russia sensed an opportunity. It started to kind of play a sophisticated game, for example, completely denying the talks that were indeed ongoing, as we know now from the leaks from, almost early November between the Russian side and the US side on how to solve this problem. So Russia has been consistently upping the ante, actually refusing to even show that it is trying to prepare its society for a ceasefire, for some kind of a solution, of a peaceful solution, which was indeed, jarring, which was, astounding to me if Russia wanted to kind of seize this opportunity of benevolent, attitude by Trump administration. And yet Russia was not budging. And so I think that situation has continued almost until the present day. So Russia has been testing the limits, and even today, the whole setup was with the American envoy. As he kind of gets into Moscow, Russia announces that it's not interested in a ceasefire, and then instead of leaving, he kind of goes forward with talks. He has apparently promised a conversation with Putin, and then Putin comes forward and says, "Well, we almost agree to the ceasefire with a few caveats that we are about to discuss." So, I mean, this is kind of very shrewd negotiation strategy. And all at the same time, you hear those leaks about Russia's, resolution and complete steel resolve to continue fighting, and the encirclement of Ukrainian troops and so forth. So again, upping the ante with some openings left in those negotiations. So the bottom line here that clearly for the Trump administration, push comes to shove very, very soon. And so Washington will need to decide, that Professor Shevel just indicated, who is kind of to blame, who is to be applied more pressure to try and move towards a solution. And not only on the war, like we are hearing, overtures from U.S. European allies such as Poland for increased presence of U.S. troops on the ground, even nuclear weapons. So is the United States going to act from the position of strength, kind of obliging Poland, or is the United States now averse to nuclear brinkmanship, which gives again overtures to Russia in this conflict? And of course, finally, I'd say Russia is clearly going to ask for formal recognition of its annexations in Ukraine. That is something that the Kremlin has been hinting at all along. And so that is going to be another moment of truth for international mediators. Can that demand be honored, and what kind of implications that may have for international order and the prospects of peacemaking or peace resolution going forward. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of our panelists. I think they've given us a lot to think about. There are different scenarios that this war may see in the next few weeks and months. I think if Russia agrees to a ceasefire, there's a question of what would come next. Would the ceasefire hold? Would it lead to some kind of negotiated settlement? If Russia refuses, then the United States would have to choose what to do next in terms of, as Oksana and Mikhail said, which side to put pressure on, so to speak. Are there any carrots or sticks that the Trump administration can use to get Putin to negotiate in good faith? That's not entirely clear. What would it take to lead to the kind of herding stalemate situation that Mikhail outlined? And if, in fact, Trump decides that normalization of relations with Russia is more important than supporting Ukraine in the long term, what does Europe do? And I know we talk about Europe as if it's a monolithic entity, but of course, in terms of what Monica said, Europe seeing this war as existential. I think European countries see it differently. If you talk to the Poles or to the Baltic countries, they may see the situation slightly differently as from countries in Western Europe. And finally, what would European support for Ukraine look like in the long term in order to preserve Ukraine's security and sovereignty? Would Europe be able to buy American weapons? Would it to backfill Ukrainian supply? Would it be able to set up a robust defense industrial complex? So those are all questions that hang over this critical juncture. Let's go ahead and take questions from all of you, please.
Maybe take a handful.
Yes.
So, my name is Yu Hen, and I recently graduated from Fletcher. I have a question, and I'm from China. So my question is more about like China's role in the Russia-Ukraine war. So before Trump took the office, China also come up with China's version of like a peace proposal. I'm just wondering, like, on your takes on like what is the difference between China's proposal and Trump's proposal at this time. That's my first question. And the second question is like, since like what has going on with Zelensky and Trump at the White House, it seems like Europe is might not trust the United States in the future, like defense and in the future security anymore. So I'm just wondering, like, does that means the Western encirclement of China is losing its effectiveness, and in the future, what's China's role in the Russia and the Ukraine war? That's my question.
Thank you.
One more.
Hi, my name is Web Hov. I'm a first-year student at Fletcher. Thank you all for the panelists for the comprehensive statements. My question is on futures of European security and Russian and European economic ties. On European security, specifically towards the recent moves by President Macron when he's talking about a French nuclear security umbrella and when he met the European military chiefs. So, like, is this a feasible plan? Is this something they will have to carve outside of NATO, or do they have to get rid of NATO? And on Russia's economy, what, assuming there is a ceasefire, which somehow holds, how will Russia reconcile to its perceptions in Europe? It's like they're assuming like, they will find their way back into the European economy, or will they, be a pariah state for, the foreseeable future? And what is Russia's plan to get back on its feet?
Thank you. Both excellent questions. Let's just go in the order we had previously. Dan, any reactions?
That was a lot. I mean, there was only 2 people asking questions, but I think I counted 6 questions. So let me answer the ones that I think I can. Can Europe trust Trump? The answer is no. That's pretty clear. If anything we've seen from the behavior of the last 2 months, it seems pretty obvious that Europeans can no longer trust the United States as a reliable security partner. Furthermore, this has been the discourse from mayors, Macron, the Polish prime minister, and so forth. So it's pretty obvious. It's just a question of what do you do with that information as a result. Can the French deterrent, be expanded? I'm going to defer to Monica, who's much more of a security person than I will, but I will point out that the French have had an independent deterrent for decades now. So it's not like this is a new thing. The question is simply whether that deterrence can be extended beyond French borders to include others. I think the other thing we shouldn't sleep on is the idea that there might be more nuclear proliferation across the European continent. Certainly one of the implications of what Trump has done with respect to sort of undermining various U.S. security guarantees, is that the logic is that if you can't rely on the U.S. to provide extended deterrence, you're going to have to provide some deterrence of your own. There are plenty of countries out there that have the technological sophistication and could develop nuclear weapons inside of 6 months. And so I think that's admittedly, this would be a violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but we're seeing a lot of treaties being ignored nowadays. So I don't necessarily think that'll be a particular barrier. In terms of Russia's plan to reintegrate within the European economy, it's worth remembering. I mean, this is a valid criticism the Trump administration has lodged, which is Europe has spent more on Russian energy over the last 3 years than they have on aiding Ukraine, because as much as they've been able to survive a lot of the cutoff from Russian energy, they still needed some, and so it is possible that can be restored, because it is in some ways for Europe the easiest way to get out of this conundrum of how they can, rely on relatively cheap supplies of energy to, among other things, maintain their manufacturing base. Because if they can't do that, there's long-term existential questions for Europe about whether or not their manufacturing economy can persist. That said, if I was Russia, the thing that I would be waiting for is not necessarily dealing with the Europe you have now, but rather the Europe you might have in 2 years if you have populist win across the board in places like France or the UK or elsewhere.
So I agree with Dan on that. And France and the nuclear issue, yeah, it hasn't needed to flex its nuclear muscle, and now it might have to. And the fact that Poland now is asking for that nuclear umbrella from the United States, big question mark. And how the U.S. responds to that under a Trump administration will be highly influential in whether other states start to arm. You may see proliferation. Look, it's the poor man's deterrence. It really is the poor state's deterrence, which is unnerving, if only because we know, anybody who's taken nuclear security classes with David Logan here or my international security class, more weapons mean the potential for more accidents, right? And so just even on the face of it, it's not a great thing. Look, the U.S. is the wild card here. I've been studying foreign policy for 40 years, right? I'm in such dissonance right now. We are the rogue state. We are mercurial. We have a mercurial president who thinks in the short term and doesn't think about the second, third, and fourth order effects of what's happening. He doesn't believe in teamwork. He believes in unilateral decision-making, doesn't have faith in multilateral institutions, cooperative agreements. It's about advancing the national interest, how he defines it, right? The U.S. national interest, America first, and he's going to pursue that. So at this point in time, we are a rogue state. So why would anybody trust us? Why would anybody trust the United States? Look, he was elected this time around with a definitive mandate. He got it. Right now, I don't know who voted for him in this room, but he was a popularly elected Democratic president. And so he feels as if he has the right to do what he's doing. Now, some of the stuff he's doing is illegal or really skirting the Constitution. But the point is that the United States right now is the one that's uncertain. Putin's been very clear, right? He's been very clear and very strategic and very patient in a way that the United States and the European powers cannot be. He was waiting for this election, keeping his fingers crossed that Trump would come in, because Volodymyr is right? He understood that President Trump was going to curry his favor. He is basically handing victory to Putin. It's what he's doing. He's handing victory. And I gave you the data. It's not clear that Putin could have won, right? If you look at the number of tanks, armor, right? The fact that now you've got 59% of Russians saying they want a peace settlement. He was on the ropes. The Russian state was on the ropes. The Ukrainian did an extraordinary job. And so that leads me to the Europeans. And look, I'm not going to beat up on the Europeans. They understand the threat that's involved, but they have not shown themselves historically to work together well and to create a cohesive security policy, right? There's no common European defense. There's supposed to be, but there's not. And then within the EU, right, there's differences with even across the region. And the fact, as Professor Drezner pointed out, they haven't divested themselves from Russian energy, right, tethers them. And what does Putin want? Putin wants to be at the table with big boy pants, right? He just does. Politically, right, he wants to be part of the G8. He wants to be part of, going to WEF and all these different fora, right? This is a period, what's unnerving about this too is this is a period of strong man politics, strong man, I use man intentionally here, right? Where individual leaders and those relationships matter. See, Jojo, you asked about China. I really do wonder right now, I'm not privy to this administration. I don't have a lot of friends in it. The negotiations that are happening in the background with Xi. And I just had a piece that just was released by Foreign Affairs, but I feel like we're in a period where spheres of influence are being carved out. We're back in the 19th century and in some ways in 1945, where you had Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States trying to figure out what the heck to do about Eastern Europe. And guess what? They divided it. And we ended up having a Cold War. So China, again, is sort of a wild card here, the degree to which China is brought in. But I'm concerned that some deals are being made and China is going to be given Asia. And because Trump doesn't care. Trump wants Canada as the 51st state. It wants Greenland. It wants critical minerals. It wants the passage, right? And then, of course, the Gulf of Mexico, which is now the Gulf of America. This is what strong men do. They want territory because it's goodies. And they can say, I'm more powerful. Look what I did. I made America greater again. So yeah, America's a rogue nation and it cannot be trusted at this particular moment in time, which is very sad.
Volodymyr, any reactions?
Yeah, very briefly, so that we can take more questions from the audience, and I think there have been a couple of questions in the chat as well. So on China, as an expert and also as Ukrainian citizen, of course, I'm not happy with what China has been doing for the last 3 years. On the one hand, formally neutral, not really sending any weapons to Russia, unlike Iran or North Korea, for instance, or troops, unlike North Korea. But on the other hand, very close with Russia, helping, it's a junior partner, it seems, Russia being a junior partner, and, not letting it go under. And I think without Chinese support, actually, that will be much more difficult for Russia to stay afloat and be in this position that they are in this war 3 years later, since the start of full-scale invasion. So Ukrainians are not necessarily happy, let's put it mildly, with China. But if you ask us about whether China can play a role in the peace process, it's still not necessarily impossible. Not to mention that China can still play a role in reconstruction of Ukraine if they want to, eventually. But right now, China is also probably not necessarily happy about being completely sidelined in the whole process, peace process around Ukraine. Not that they worry, I think, that Russia and US are getting too cozy for their own, comfort, but still, they have their own ambitions and harbor ambitions, and they're great power, superpower, really. And they are suddenly nowhere to be seen, and no one is asking their position, and they don't have a role to play. So I don't think they're very, very feeling very comfortably right now. On Macron, I think that, well, first of all, we need to remember that France has been historically very independent on its nuclear policy of the rest of NATO, and of course left even the military structures within NATO for decades before returning much later. So there is a strong legacy originated by de Gaulle and continued by Macron, being a Gaullist, of course, in that particular respect. So they can offer their nuclear weapons protection and umbrella to whoever takes it. But I think it would depend on what Trump does on NATO. If Trump does certain things that paralyzes NATO, then French would think and others outside of the box, and look at what even Friedrich Merz is saying these days, the most probably future chancellor of Germany. But if Trump actually does not block or paralyze NATO, then I don't think that France and others would dare to go it along without Americans. And the same thing, by the way, with peacekeepers in Ukraine. There was one question actually in the chat that I don't think Europeans would send their peacekeepers if there is a strong opposition, not just from Russia, but also from US. This is just not feasible. The backstop by US, it's one thing, very important, crucial element of it. To be happening, this peacekeepers being sent to Ukraine at some point, maybe. But if Trump says, I don't want Europeans, I don't like strongly this idea of Europeans sending troops, then probably they wouldn't do it because against both Washington and Moscow is probably too much of a pull, too much of a responsibility for Europeans to do it by themselves, just go it along. And finally, on Russia and Europe, I think there are people who are just dreaming to go to business as usual, even after the horror that Russia unleashed on Ukraine in the last 3 years. There are people like that. For instance, it's not impossible. Absolutely, it's quite feasible, I think, to imagine that in the coming months, maybe there will be American corporations going back to Russia and doing business with Russia and in Russia. And if Americans do it, then what do you think Germans are going to wait for? So, and others. So we'll see. We'll see. But I think that regrettably for us in Ukraine, there are too many people who didn't think it was a major wake-up call and have learned a lesson, of being in the needle of Russian energy supply for too long, but they're kind of waiting for going back to business as usual.
Thanks, Volodymyr. And the question Volodymyr referred to in the Zoom chat has to do with the possibility of European countries sending troops as peacekeepers to Ukraine and the legal implications of that in terms of NATO's Articles 5 and 6. Would that in effect be a backdoor for Ukraine into NATO? Would those troops be under protections? That's an interesting question for us to ponder. Mikhail.
Okay, I can go next. Yeah, so with regards to China, I mean, it's completely enigmatic. It's like the style of, disappearing ministers, Xingang, and, who knows what's going on in China. And for the same reason, for Sino-Russian relations. So China kind of seemed to have been hedging its bets. And then right now, it seems as if China is indeed upset by the kind of lenient approach of what it thinks, the Trump administration is pursuing vis-a-vis Russia. So you had that statement by the Chinese ambassador to the EU who said, well, that what's going on kind of is worrisome because, how about the norms of international law, the UN Charter and so forth, clearly kind of alluding to the possibility of, territorial adjustments, annexations and so forth. But what you make of it is anyone's guess. I mean, there are sinologists who tell us, well, never mind, they just are coordinating that with Russia. China just had to make the statement. And so they informed Moscow in advance and then went ahead with it. So difficult to say. Then when it comes to Europe, well, I mean, we just heard by Alexander Lukashenko, who kind of this bring them on style, said, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has probably never seen a gun in her life. And she is talking about, nuclear guarantees and so forth. So this kind of bragger, I mean, will it be met by a response? And I think it will, given this dynamic of, chiefs of staff meeting under Macron's, presidency, and chairmanship with Turkey in attendance, for example, that looks serious. So if the United States decides to apply pressure on Ukraine in this current situation rather than Russia, as Professor Shevel suggested, then I think the role of Europe and Europe as the audience of those members of the would-be ceasefire of the conflict, Europe as this audience will be able to impose at least some audience costs on the US by saying, look, you just promised to impose sanctions on Russia and now you are doing something different, right? So I think what Europe has been doing is going to be consequential. And then finally, is Russia going to be a pariah after after a solution is reached? Again, it depends on the terms, and it depends on who is in charge in Russia at that point. But I guess this current momentum, the interest in minerals, in returning, in like automakers returning to Russia, in U.S. Companies taking over some oil refineries in Germany, right, to resume oil flow from Russia. This all has been overstated and oversold. Like, I mean, Volkswagen used to sell 2% of its cars in Russia, and the risks are enormous still. So I am not sure, even if some shaky ceasefire is reached, whether the companies themselves, even if the sanctions are completely lifted as part of the deal, whether those companies would be willing to go back to Russia. Some apparel makers, you just, go in and out if necessary for sure, but another round of long-term investment, of trying to affiliation, kind of throw your lot together with Russia, that is going to be problematic because of the trust issue, I believe, anyway.
I'll be very brief, so we have time for another round or two. I'll just share a couple of thoughts on the Europe question. A few things that I would note. First of all, I think this notion that, which I think both Trump and Putin share, that just as East European states and Ukraine and so forth kind of by right belong to Russia and essentially don't matter and Russia gets to decide, I think there is perception from the rogue, I think it's very well put, that these Europeans kind of don't matter, right? That essentially Trump can want them, can make them do what he wants. And I think that's a misnomer. I think Europe, for all the problems with coordination there, like the EU, many actors, herding cats, they do have agency. And I think if it came to this situation, which again would testify to the rogue leadership now in this country, that there was some sort of Russia-US alliance, right? Had, indeed Putin sticks to his maximalist demands and US decides to lean on Ukraine and not on Russia. And the question is sort of, is Europe-Ukraine alliance, would it oppose Russia-Ukraine? Russia-US alliance, right? Like if it came to that. And I think the Europeans, from the talk at least that's coming out recently, are now kind of saying things that maybe before they wouldn't have said. I think the question, I agree with Dan, sort of would they put their money where the mouth is, right? But it is statements from President Macron, this von der Leyen decision, recently announcement about $800 billion, the security thing, like they talk about the sky, what's it called? The sky, there is something about the air protection for Western Ukraine, kind of things that before were not really discussed. Now, and Russia is actually, given where their money is, like the sanctions and the trade has been more with the EU, right? So even if sort of it came to this, that say US were to lift some sanctions, Europeans don't have to follow. They can confiscate the money, they can continue supporting Ukraine. So this sort of notion that these smaller countries don't matter, I think we should really not fall for that. And the last thing that I would mention, that's also something I was referring to in my opening remarks, can Europe really compensate enough, or at least somewhat enough, for Ukraine to be able to continue resisting, again, if there is no agreement reached at the negotiation table and Russia sticks to its maximalist goals? I am sort of remembering off the top of my head some statistics that I read. Ukraine now is not Ukraine in 2022. They now, I think, about 40% of Ukrainian military kind of production and stuff is domestic, if I am remembering correctly. About 30% comes from the US, 30% comes from Europe, right? Russia, even though it is bigger, has more men and so forth, doesn't clearly have the capacity to take over large cities and so forth, right? So again, if, say, Europeans support these 800 billion and other forms that are now being discussed, if it was committed, right, that could be significant as for sort of affecting the outcomes. But I would echo Monica's point that the US being a rogue state and Europeans not being able to trust them. And now all of these decades of alliances are appended, and essentially kind of leaders are scrambling for what would be, what would we do, what could we do if US really begins to act in a way it hasn't acted since the Second World War.
Excellent. A lot to think about. So we'll have one final round of questions. Let me take a couple of questions from Zoom and then from any of you who have your hands raised. One question from Zoom asks about the 4 regions of Ukraine, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, which Russia has been inflexible about. How likely is it that Trump will pressure Ukraine to surrender these territories? And finally, perhaps for Monica, what are the lessons Putin is taking away from this war for the future of Russia's military? Other hands. Please, up there.
Me?
Yep.
Mikhail hinted at this. Something that I think is really fascinating about the US pivot away from European security is the consequence for Europe's relationship with Turkey. It's sensible that they would be looking to Turkey, as they seem to be doing now, second largest military in NATO. They've shown that they can contain or combat against Russia and Libya, in Syria, and so on. Donald Tusk was saying yesterday that he's interested in supporting Turkish EU accession, which is reopening a debate from a long time ago. It's something that would be transformative for Europe if it was plausible, because it would mean a lot for Europe's relationship with third countries, given what's going on in Syria right now, perhaps the way that Europe interacts with Israel. We're already seeing that diversion between European and American approaches to Syria. maybe already moving in this kind of direction. It's the immigration consequences would be enormous. Free movement of people for a country of that population size with the GDP per capita that's a lot lower than Western Europe put a lot of strain on domestic politics. And then the third thing that I'm really interested in hearing about is the way that Europe thinks about these small L liberalism values within the European Union. We've seen the debates within Europe about Hungary, civil society, separation of powers, free press. Would a further embrace of Turkey or other countries mean a different way of thinking within the European Union about what it thinks about those sorts of components? And do you think that that's possible in a more hard-headed, pragmatic phase in European thinking about security?
Thanks so much.
And two more questions. Yes.
Kevin, I'm a MA student here. So real quick question and quick statement up front. I think it's dangerous to classify the US as a rogue nation. I think that puts us in a box of, puts the US in the same box as Iran, actors like just those types, it's putting us in the same box. And I don't think that's a fair comparison to the current 2 months of the administration really trying to move a different direction. So my question would be, if you were in the administration and advising the president, I hear a lot out of academia of having the answers. How would you advise the president? Continue the way that we've gone the last 4 years, or how would you advise him in the negotiations to pursue a peaceful end? And what would that look like from the academic side of this if they were advising the president?
Excellent. Important question. Last but not least.
I'm an alum and I've been with the program for a while. Can you speak more on the minerals deal? It seems like it's a part of a larger security agenda. I'm still unsure about what security guarantees the US will give Ukraine. Am I inaudible?
The question is about the minerals deal.
Oh, the minerals deal.
minerals.
Sorry, I missed the word. I missed the word.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, I might be wrong. It seems like it's part of like a larger security agenda. It's still unclear about the security guarantees the US will provide Ukraine, but the US is trying to do this in different areas like Greenland, Jersey. And so, I mean, it's something the Britain had done in the 1990s.
Great. So we have less than 10 minutes. Who would like to start, please?
So Kevin, thanks. Yeah, I think it's painful as an American to be able to say or saying that. But I would say that we've been a rogue state for some time. I mean, I just published a book that shows just basically how hyper-militarized the United States. Iran, there's a reason why Iran's very fearful, right? The United States keeps going after it and supporting Israel to go after it. Not to say Iran is, a friendly, great nation, but the United States is really strong and powerful, and we've allowed our hubris to get the better of us, right? When you're strong and powerful, you should show more grace, right? And the United States has not been doing that, and I think that the Trump administration, the second one, is a culmination of things that have been happening, not just with President Trump, but the rapidity and the speed with which this is happening. They made it very clear that they were going to deconstruct this government and that they were going to press allies. Look, I don't know if you remember back to the first administration when he embarrassed Angela Merkel, right? An ally, right? And just taking down our allies. You don't do that, particularly when you're a strong power. So I think I'm comfortable saying that we are a rogue nation, and we have been, and it's not just the Trump administration. President Biden tried to correct it a little bit, pulling us out of Afghanistan. I don't know how you feel about that, but that was to courage. Right? 4 other presidential administrations did not have the courage to say, we're losing there, we're creating a lot of havoc there, it's time to get out. So it's the United States writ large. I'm not going to make a comment on the mineral deal. For the advice to Putin or whatever, thinking about Putin, what did he learn, the lessons learned? That first question, Arik, is be patient. Democracies are fragile. You can find the seams and you just keep working on it, right? So these measures that he puts into place, in the old days, it took 6 years for the FSB and all the cronies within the FSB to crack the surface on our AIDS, right? Saying that AIDS was a plot against African Americans in the United States. Took 6 years for that to finally hit mainstream. we're down to 6 months, if not 6 weeks. So these, measures, what is it called, MIDI, activní měry, the active measures, Putin has learned that democracies are fragile and that what he's doing is effective and it can work. Look, there's evidence Brexit was in part manipulated, evidence about US elections, we don't know how grave. And then, of course, Romania just canceled a series of elections because Russia was implicated in that. So I think those lessons are there, which is that autocrats can be patient, democracies are fragile, and they don't have that timeline to make planning. And then in terms of the 4 regions, sorry, I mean, I cannot imagine that the United States, given under President Trump, under the current administration, basically, Volodymyr put it beautifully. They're conditionalizing everything that Ukraine has to give up, and it's unconditional to Putin. And Putin has made it very clear that once those territories went into the Russian constitution, they're Russian. Right. And now he has a narrative, we're back to nationalism, to say it's Russian territory, and he can jimmy up his population to say, we are not going to give away what we gave, that we got through our life's blood. And unfortunately, right, it was illegal what he did. He went into a country, occupied it, and then basically stole it, and thinks through illegal, machinations that he can say and declare that it's Russian territory. But under Trump, they're not going to be forced to give it back.
They don't have full control over.
They do not. Look, and this comes back to Oksana and my other comments. Maybe I'll hand it over to Oksana. The Ukrainians are not going to give up. They're just not. We're going to have guerrilla warfare. It's going to be really nasty and dirty.
Yeah, I'll just comment on the regions, and maybe Volodymyr can comment on the minerals. I think exactly as Monica is saying, it's not only that Russia wants, and I think this is kind of what current administration is in support of, that Ukraine de facto cannot recapture the territory Russia now de facto controls, right? And that is sort of reality on the ground. And I'm thinking, even though as long as this sort of acknowledgement does not amount to Ukraine's formal surrender of these territories, constitutional change and so forth, it might be the kind of compromise Zelensky can sell domestically, right? But certainly not giving up additional territory, which is what Russia demands. And if you look also at Ukrainian geography, I think identity is hugely important. I agree with Monica. But if you look at the geography, Kherson, right, where the scenes of jubilation when it was liberated in the fall of 22, sits on the other bank of the Dnipro River. That opens the way to Odessa in Mykolaiv and elsewhere in Ukraine, right? So even sort of for purely kind of military thing, and they haven't been able to capture it, they were kicked out of it. And in Donbass, none of these major cities have been captured for how many years now, right? So the notion, I don't know, I don't know if you all think that Trump could actually lean on Ukraine to give additional territory, which is what Putin wants. I'm not going to say yes or no. I just don't know. This administration is completely unpredictable. But I mean, it's important to keep in mind that we're not just talking about territorial control of the current Russian holdings, but we're talking about additional territory. And Kherson in particular creates this very important strategic consequence for any kind of future invasion, and so forth. And then on the question about what the advice will be, well, nobody's going to ask me. But they did actually. I would say lean on Russia, right? I mean, this is what this administration should do. It has a lot of cards, to use President Trump's vocabulary, right? They can tell, look, Russia, you control this territory, we are not going to support Ukraine to sort of try to maybe recapture it militarily, but you don't get to replace government in Kyiv, you don't get to get additional territory, you want to deal, let's deal, right? So that would be my advice to the administration.
Yeah, on the question of the U.S. being a rogue state, let's use slightly different language. The U.S. is a radically revisionist actor in a way that they haven't been for, quite some time, or since Trump's first term. But you're asking about what should be done in comparison to the status quo, suggesting that was not all that tolerable. And I would push back about as vigorously as I possibly can on that point, because the striking thing to me is that it doesn't matter which international relations theory you adhere to, they all would recommend that the United States should aid Ukraine, right? If you're a constructivist, the thing you care about is the fact that Russia violated the norm of territorial sovereignty, just flat out. And so if you allow that to go on, then basically you're suggesting it makes it easier for China to look at Taiwan. It makes it easier for other countries to start, considering annexing territory. If you're a liberal, obviously Ukraine is the more democratic actor. Ukraine is the more pro-Western actor. You obviously want to support a democracy as opposed to an autocratic state. It is worth aiding Ukraine for that reason. And if you really want to be like a cold-hearted realist, arming Ukraine is the cheapest way the United States can keep Russia down. We have given the Ukraine, about $150 billion in aid. It's not that much over 3 years. We continue to do that, then the United States is bleeding Russia dry. And it's worth remembering that prior to 2022, there were a lot of concerns about Russia making inroads in the Baltics or on other NATO allies. This is the best way that you can actually ensure NATO security is to continue to keep Russia bogged down in Ukraine. And I would also add that, you know, the sort of gift thing on this is that you've managed to completely erode Putin's nuclear deterrent threat, because that's been eviscerated by Salami-style tactics over the last 3 years. So the implication that you shouldn't have been doing, or that the sort of status quo prior to Trump wasn't working, I guess I would push back on that. I actually think the status quo was working reasonably well. It wasn't great for Ukraine, obviously, but, you know, it was better than the alternative. And there were a variety of upsides to pursuing that approach. In terms of, now I'll just leave it at that because we're
And also, they were losing the war. And if you look at the data,
Russia
was losing the war.
Final comments from either Mikhail or Volodymyr.
Yes.
Can just say a couple of words. My scenario for territorial negotiation would certainly not be that Russia demands the entirety of the 4 Ukrainian regions it now has written into its constitution, but rather it kind of agrees to maybe cede some territory in exchange for legal recognition of what Russia would name legal recognition of the transfer of that territory. And that's the moment of truth again. So the European Union countries are not hard-pressed to recognize annexations. Likely Ukraine is not, but then what about the United States? So Ukraine is dependent on US position. So where it goes, and if Ukraine faces the stark choice of, you know, regaining some territory as a result of Russia's goodwill, while recognizing that the rest kind of goes to Russia, that's going to be a difficult choice. I think Ukraine will renege, and then, you know, much will depend on what position the US is going to take. But that's my scenario. Certainly not more territory unless war kind of continues to go. And then finally about Turkey, I think Turkey is very opportunistic, and I wouldn't, you know, bet money on Turkey, you know, joining the European Union anytime soon. All the backstops are there, all the problems, stumbling blocks are there. But Turkey is indeed upset with the possibility of Russia, you know, really winning big in Ukraine, and they are probably concerned with the Black Sea, and as just Oksana mentioned, with Russia's crossing the Dnieper River, and, you know, getting access to Odessa and so forth. So Turkey is now staunchly on the side of those who want to contain Russia, but that's purely tactical. You know, Erdogan will change tack as soon as, you know, some solution transpires. Thank you.
Well, yeah, maybe Volodymyr, I should echo what Mikhail said about skepticism about Turkey, but I do think that the EU's longtime dream about strategic autonomy is definitely back on the table. Volodymyr, final comments.
Yes, absolutely. On Turkey, it's an interesting player, always been maneuvering, balancing, as we know, with some interesting thinking about their role. And we actually had a first-hand experience in 2023 when we went with Tufts students, Fletcher students to Turkey. You know, and Arik and Monica were part of that group. So we had some interesting conversations back then. And ever since, Turkey wanted to play a bigger role. And now is the time, you know, and we're having them doubling down on statements in support of Ukraine and our territorial integrity, and working with Europeans, not only Poles, but others in Europe now say it's about time to actually extend the hand to Turkey. So that's an interesting play. We'll see where it goes. Is it some kind of which is going to be curtailed or limited, some kind of a tactical move, or something which would become a longer-term trend? On 4 regions of Ukraine, I think that, of course, they should recognize everyone in Washington and Moscow that Ukraine is not going to offer any formal recognition of this territory as joining Russian Federation. And of course, no one is going to give them the land. And I hope Trump understands that if he somehow decides to apply pressure on Ukraine on that, that would be a non-starter, you know, at the expense of Ukraine is basically completely leaving the whole negotiation framework in the process. So, you know, I hope he doesn't do it, and I hope he realizes that it's not doable. On minerals deal, I don't worry about it too much. There was some kind of a big political favor by Ukraine to Trump, so that Trump could show it to his crowd, you know, say, see, I've got a get this money back or be able to from Ukraine that Biden gave them. But of course, it's up in the clouds. No one knows what's going to happen with that deal. The framework agreement is not signed yet. So not to mention about the more, detailed treaty. Is it going to work or not? Ukrainians are not worrying about that. We always understood that this deal is somehow is a gate opener to trying and get Trump people on the side of Ukraine.
Great. Well, we are not only out of time, we are over time. So thank you all for the questions, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for an excellent conversation. Please join me in a round of applause. Thanks, everyone.